will be discussing the American Revolution in two parts. Part 1 are the causes of the American Revolution, and Part 2 is American independence, the American Revolutionary War, and changes that occurred as a result of the American Revolution. Part 1, the causes of the American Revolution. The objective for Part 1 of this lecture is to understand the causes of the American Revolution. The American Revolution occurred in the latter part of the 1700s. However, history isn't linear, so I will be discussing themes, ideas, and events that occurred prior to the latter part of the 1700s. There were two major causes of the American Revolution. First, it was the colonists' perception that the English Empire violated their rights as Englishmen. And second was the 7 Years' War. In order to understand the colonists' perception that the English Empire violated their rights as Englishmen, you have to understand the English ideas of freedom before the American Revolution. Specifically, the English law and the idea of liberty. The English law and the idea of liberty was that obedience to the law protects individuals and property. So in other words, if you obey the law, then you and your property were protected. The English did not have one formally written constitution like there is in America today. The English Constitution consists of a body of laws. And the cornerstone to that body of laws is the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta was created in the year 1215, and it embodied English freedom and guaranteed the rights of Englishmen. The Magna Carta protected people's property, and it guaranteed against abuses of political power, including against the power of the king. The king was subject to the law under the Magna Carta. Under the Magna Carta, you couldn't imprison someone for no reason. One example of that is called habeas corpus. And habeas corpus is the protection against being imprisoned without a legal charge. We actually have habeas corpus in America. You can file habeas corpus in the event that you have no other alternative. Also under the Magna Carta, you couldn't take someone's property without due process of law. An example of this was trial by jury. However, only people who benefited from the idea that you couldn't take someone's property without due process of law were the elite. Because the elite were the only ones who owned property. Remember, there is a two-tier system in England and the English colonies. There were the aristocrats who could own property by inheriting it, and then there was everybody else. Two events that influenced the American Revolution were the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution. The English Civil War took place in the 1640s, and it was a struggle for power between Parliament and the monarchy. Parliament had accused the monarchy of jeopardizing liberty by imposing a tax without the Parliament's consent. It also accused the monarchy of imprisoning political enemies. As a result of all this, civil war breaks out, and ultimately, Parliament wins. So the monarchy was abolished, at least temporarily. And it was declared a commonwealth and a free state led by Oliver Cromwell. The monarchy was later restored in 1660. But the English Civil War creates a discussion of liberty and authority. What did it mean to be a free Englishman? It creates a discussion of equality. And this discussion of equality will influence the colonists. There was even talk of a written constitution at the time.
Next, we have the Glorious Revolution. The Glorious Revolution occurred in 1688, and it was about a small group of aristocrats who were fearful that the monarchy was moving away from Protestantism and toward Catholicism, mostly because of the next king, James II, was Catholic, so they feared that the monarchy would become Catholic. So Parliament took over and implanted a Bill of Rights, and these are civil rights. Civil rights such as freedom from unreasonable searches and self-government, which is taxation only by their elected representatives. They also included civilian rule and not military rule. These are all ideas of freedom that spread to the American colonies. However, these freedoms were not necessarily treated as equal in the English colonies. For example, slaves were not considered equal to elite white men. It was elite white men at the top of the hierarchy and slaves at the bottom of the hierarchy. The 7 Years' War was the second major cause of the American Revolution. This is a map of the French territory prior to the 7 Years' War. If you'll remember from an earlier lecture, this is where the New France colony was located. The 7 Years' War occurred over a land dispute between Great Britain and France. And when I say Great Britain, I'm including the British American colonies. In the mid-1700s, the Virginia government gave a land grant of 500,000 acres to the Ohio Company, which consisted of Virginia's elite society, such as George Washington. The war will include British forces and French forces and Indians, such as the Iroquois. The Iroquois realized that a relationship with one global power, such as France, was risky. If another power were to challenge that power, they would be in trouble economically. So they played Britain against France and allied with both. Spain will later ally with France, and ultimately Britain wins the war. And the war ends with the Peace of Paris of 1763. The Peace of Paris included the following. France ceded Canada to Britain. France got Guadeloupe and the Martinique, or the Sugar Islands. Spain ceded Florida to Britain. The Philippines and Cuba went to Spain. Britain had seized those places during the war. And Spain got Louisiana colony from France. Of course, that's going to later switch back to France. So you can see how much territory Britain got as a result of the war. This is the territory prior to the war. This is the territory after the war. So the main point here is that Britain then controlled the continent east of the Mississippi River, and it ends French presence on the continent. The war was important because it ended the harmonious relationship with the Indians, particularly in Pennsylvania, and Indians will now have to rely on the British rule. This will initially spark an Indian rebellion against British rule led by Pontiac. It's called Pontiac's Rebellion. But the British will put down Pontiac's Rebellion and prohibit further settlement on those lands. And here is the crux of why the 7 Years' War was a cause of the American Revolution. The 7 Years' War cost the English Empire a lot of money, and so did these Indian rebellions. So the British Empire taxed the British colonies to help pay for the war. And this will create a growing division between the English Empire and what will become the American colonies. The taxes included the Sugar Act, the Currency Act, the Stamp Act, the Tea Act, and the Intolerable Acts. The Sugar Act reduced tax on molasses imported to North America from the West Indies. So what it did was it undercut the merchants in the British American colonies. The Currency Act said that the British colonies couldn't issue paper legal tender. The Stamp Act wasn't really a tax. The Stamp Act said that all printed material had to carry a stamp purchased from British authorities. So if you wanted to have paper, you had to have a stamp on it, and that you had to pay for that stamp. So it was a way that Britain financed British operations, including paying for their prior war with France. The Tea Act happened because Britain bailed out the East India Company by dumping Chinese tea on American markets. And it gave the East India Company tax exemptions, which undercut the British American merchants. The colonists didn't want to pay the tax on those large imports. They felt that Britain didn't have a right to tax the colonies. That resulted in the Boston Tea Party. The Boston Tea Party was when the British colonists dumped the tea out into the harbor, and as a result of that, the British Empire will implement the Intolerable Acts. Britain also closed the port of Boston until the tea was paid for. The Intolerable Acts also included reduced town meetings, and the British appointed members to the local town councils in the British colonies instead of by election, which had previously happened. Britain also lodged the British soldiers in private homes. So this is going to create a conflict between Britain and the British American colonists. And it will create two divergent points of view, one by the colonists and one by the British Empire. The colonists saw these taxes as a violation of their rights as Englishmen. They had no representation in Parliament. So they felt that they were being unfairly taxed. In other words, taxation without representation. The British point of view was that Britain assumed that they would pass these acts and the colonists would just pay them. They were not expecting the colonists to protest. Britain saw itself as the mother and the colonies as its child. In other words, the colonies were subordinate to the English Empire's government. So in other words, the British Empire was the mother telling their children what to do, and then children were supposed to obey that. The colonists responded with coordinated acts of resistance, such as the boycotting of British goods. They also formed the Sons of Liberty. The Sons of Liberty was a group of men who came from a variety of class backgrounds, such as middling class, shopkeepers, and artisans. When I say middling class, I don't mean the middle class of today. Middling class were people who had wealth but were not necessarily considered aristocrats. The Sons of Liberty came together and existed in more than 50 colonial cities and towns. They patrolled city streets. They looted British aristocrats' homes. They burned down the chariots of British aristocrats. For all intents and purposes, they were considered thugs meant to bully the British aristocrats. The colonists formed the First Continental Congress in response to the Intolerable Acts. The First Continental Congress included leaders from 12 colonies except Georgia. Those leaders included John Adams, Sam Adams, Patrick Henry, George Washington, etc. They urged the colonists not to pay taxes and not to obey new British laws. They called for the cease of trading with Great Britain and the West Indies. They formed committees to oversee those new mandates. So why does this matter? The First Continental Congress matters because it's the first time we see intercolonial representative government. This is a turning point. This is an historical significance of the First Continental Congress. It was also the first instance of intercolonial cooperation, separate from the English Empire. It's the first time you see the British colonists becoming a political, coherent group. It's a grassroots response. The way it was before the First Continental Congress was that these colonies acted separately. They were not a cohesive unit. Now we have a cohesive unit of colonies responding to the British Empire. It is also significant because it's the first clear moment that we saw cross-class cooperation, meaning middle classes interacting with farmers, artisans, etc. This indicated that the society was changing. There's still a hierarchy, but the society was still changing. But understand that not everybody was on board with the American Revolution. People like the Loyalists were not on board. They were fine and happy with the English Empire.
The American Revolution, Part 2, Independence, War, and Changes. The objectives for Part 2 of this lecture are: be able to explain the Enlightenment and how it influenced American ideals, be able to explain the American Revolutionary War and its social aspects, and understand the political, economic, and social changes as a result of the American Revolution. The American Revolutionary War began with skirmishes between the British and the colonists at Concord and Lexington. It was started when Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys from Vermont and B. Arnold from Connecticut took a fort in New York. And of course, the British fought back. So it's clear that there's going to be a war for independence. So the colonists formed the Second Continental Congress. This Congress authorized raising an army and printed money to pay for it, and appointed George Washington as the commander of the Continental Army. I mentioned that the American Revolution was not initially about the colonists seeking independence from Britain. There were a number of people who did not want independence from Britain. They were called the Loyalists. But there were others who did want independence from Britain. And one of those people was Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine wrote a pamphlet called Common Sense, which supported American independence, and it justified American independence. In this pamphlet, Paine attacked the British, specifically hereditary rule and monarchy. Paine said that America was better off independent, that the new nation would be an asylum for all mankind, that it was about a symbol of freedom from tyranny. And this is the idea of American exceptionalism. The idea of American exceptionalism was born during the Revolution. American exceptionalism is the idea that America is a unique model of freedom for the rest of the world. We still talk about and use this idea of American exceptionalism in today's society. This pamphlet appealed to the common man. It was posted in taverns. It was posted on trees and in all towns. This pamphlet was a new style of writing because it was written for the common man and not the educated audiences. Thomas Paine subscribed to the Enlightenment and deism. I'll talk a little bit more about the Enlightenment a little bit later. But the Enlightenment was an ideology that believed in science and reason and logic and natural laws and rights. In other words, they didn't believe in miracles. They believed that everything happened for a reason. Now, there were those who were deists who believed that God basically took the world like winding up a clock and letting it go, and things happened the way they were supposed to happen. So the colonists declared independence from Britain and did so in a formal document called the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence was written on July 2nd, 1776. It was written primarily by Thomas Jefferson, and it's significant because it is about independence and not renegotiating taxes, etc. with Britain. They are done with that. They are now officially declaring independence from Britain. The Declaration of Independence includes a preamble written by Thomas Jefferson and a list of grievances against King George II. Grievances about taxes, quartering of troops in the colonial homes, etc. So I want to focus on the preamble itself. The preamble states this: we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In this preamble, all of the ideas except this one, all men are created equal, were derived from the English Constitution. All men are created equal was new to the American Republic. Because if you'll remember, in England, they had a two-tiered system. The aristocrats who owned property and everybody else. So all men were not created equal under the English Constitution. The Founding Fathers were influenced by John Locke, who was a philosopher and subscribed to the Enlightenment. If you'll remember, the Enlightenment is about science and reason, logic, natural laws, and rights. And John Locke also influenced the English Constitution. So in order to understand the ideas in the Declaration of Independence, and then later the Constitution, you need to understand John Locke, because it's his ideas that influence the Founding Fathers for the new republic. Locke argued that individuals had unalienable rights. Unalienable rights are rights that are so basic that you can't give them away, and the government or anyone else can't take them away. He didn't mean that the government had to give people property or help them acquire property. Just when they got it, they had a right to keep it. This was not a new idea. This came from the English Constitution. And Locke was reaffirming this. You couldn't take property without due process. We learned that from the Magna Carta. The Founding Fathers didn't think that this applied to women because women didn't matter. Women were dependent on men. And the Founding Fathers also didn't think this applied to slaves. So again, when I say all men are created equal, what they really mean is all white men. Also in the preamble, we have that among those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Originally, the preamble stated the pursuit of property and not the pursuit of happiness. Locke argued that all men were entitled to life, liberty, and property. But this idea of property was changed. And there is a debate amongst historians about why it was changed from property to the pursuit of happiness. One scholar argues that Jefferson was making a distinction that real property could be given away, a physical thing, and the right to achieve harmony, security, and stability is the pursuit of happiness. No one can prevent us from trying to achieve happiness. That's the underlying idea here. But again, this is a slippery slope when it comes to women, and particularly to slaves, because if you're a slave, you can't pursue your happiness. And if you're a woman and you're under the thumb of your husband, you also can't pursue happiness. I'm going to focus on another part of the preamble. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Locke argued that the government was necessary. We needed government because over time the strong will prey upon the weak. He argued that the government and the people have a social contract. Locke said the government only had authority because individuals have made a voluntary agreement to be governed. This is the idea of a social contract. Therefore, government power comes from those who agreed to be governed. He also believed that citizens and governments have responsibility, and that governments are not separate from people. So the idea here is really the consent of the government. That the government can only exist if the people agree to it. So I want to mention two theories of government. One is republicanism, and the other is constitutionalism. Republicanism refers to a form of government without a monarchy. And constitutionalism is a form of government that is derived from fundamental law. So, America is a constitutional republic because we are a government without a king or a monarchy, and we are also derived from fundamental law called the Constitution. America is also referred to as a constitutional democracy, but there is some argument about that. We are a democracy, but we're not a true democracy by definition. A true democracy by definition is a government that has direct representation. So in other words, a city council is an example of a true democracy because in a city council, everybody votes. So when they vote on something, everybody says aye or nay on it. But in American democracy, at the higher levels, we have representatives who vote for us. So when you have someone that votes for you, you are not a direct democracy. Now, you directly elect them to vote for you, but still that's not a true democracy. The Revolutionary War was fought between Britain and the American colonists. It also included France and Spain, who helped out the American colonists. The American colonist army was called the Continental Army, and it consisted of volunteer, militias, and drafted men. Militias were basically local law enforcement. During the war, there were approximately 200,000 soldiers who fought. Their age ranges were 16 to 45 years old, and 1 in 20 died during the war. Those who fought were not only white men, but they were also Indians, blacks, and former slaves. The number of blacks and former slaves who fought in the war was approximately 5,000. Former slaves allied with American colonists and were promised freedom if they enlisted. For example, this is an illustration of the Rhode Island Regiment. It was a racially integrated regiment with white officers. This type of integration often happened more in the North than it did in the South. So the Army would pay owners compensation for loss of property when they enlisted slaves. American colonists could also substitute someone in their place. So in other words, if a prominent American colonist did not want to send their son into war, they could substitute one of their slaves in place of their son. In the South, slaves enlisted in the war, but were generally not promised freedom. The slaves in the South also included those who had been offered freedom from the British Army. Other slaves worked for British Army as spies, as cooks, as laundresses, construction workers, etc. For example, some of Washington's slaves fled to the British. So you have slaves fighting for the American colonists, and you have slaves fighting for the British. As for the role of women in the Revolutionary War, women did not fight in the war. Rather, they helped provide support for the war. For example, there was the Daughters of Liberty, which were the counterpart of the Sons of Liberty. The Daughters of Liberty raised funds to help soldiers, provided homespun goods to the army, and passed information regarding British Army movement. So in other words, they were female spies. A couple of key battles during the Revolutionary War included Trenton in Saratoga, which was a turning point of the war, because this is where the American colonists severely hurt the British with the help of the French. And then there was Valley Forge, which was basically the beginning of the end of the Revolutionary War. There were also battles fought in the South, such as Yorktown. The war ended with the Treaty of Paris of 1783. So, the Treaty of Paris not only ended the Revolutionary War, it recognized American independence. And under this treaty, the American colonists gained control of the region between Canada and Florida east of the Mississippi River and right of arms to the Atlantic waters off of Canada. So basically British territory. And then finally, under the Treaty of Paris, the loyalists to Britain would not be persecuted. After the war, there were both political and social changes. There were changes in voting. Some states required property ownership to vote. For example, Virginia did that. And other states no longer required property ownership, such as Pennsylvania. There was also changes in religion and morality. There was more religious tolerance in most states. This idea of separation of church and state became a concept after the American Revolution. This idea of separation of church and state was the idea of a wall of separation. There is a separation between politics and religion. Religion should not control politics. So many churches no longer provided funding for churches except for Massachusetts. This idea of the wall of separation was generally a Thomas Jefferson idea. And it drew a line between private and public authority. Madison said that the new nation offered an asylum to the persecuted and oppressed of every nation and religion. They believed in a virtuous citizenry. In other words, the ability to sacrifice self-interest for the public good. Social changes included a loss of land by the Indians. The number of free blacks increased, and it increased to about 200,000 by 1810, and that was mostly because of slaves who had gained their freedom as a result of them fighting in the war. And many slaves gained independence by fighting in the war. 5,000 fought for America, and others fought for Britain. Those that fought for Britain settled in England or other countries. and some were re-enslaved. Slavery remained strong in the South. There was about 700,000 slaves by 1790. As far as changes for women, life didn't really change very much for women. Husbands still had authority over their wives. Women still could not participate politically. They couldn't vote. So the role of women at this time was something called Republican motherhood. And Republican motherhood was the idea that women's role was to train future citizens, that they needed to instill in their sons these ideas of liberty and government, that it was the woman's role to educate their sons to be good American citizens. There was also changes in the hierarchical authority of the elders in the colonies. After the American Revolution, the young people will start to no longer pay deference to the older authority in the colonies, because the American Revolution was seen as the future. Out with the old, in with the new. And part of that old was this deference for authority. So you will start to see the young people no longer have that type of respect for the older generations. All right, so this ends the lecture. If you have any questions, please let me know.